first of 4 lectures on the thought of Wilfred Bion. And today I'm going to begin by talking about group psychology, first reviewing Freud's theory of group psychology as set forth in Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, published in 1921, and then later today turning to Bion's work, published in Experiences in Groups. So turning to Freud, first of all, let's note that year of publication, 1921. It's only 4 years later that Hitler publishes Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Reading Freud's group psychology, I've always felt I could almost hear the Nazis marching in the streets as they began to do a few years after Freud's publication in 1921. It's interesting that in Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, he celebrates what he calls the Führerprinzip in German. That's the leader principle, which established Hitler as the one and only person to whom party members owed loyalty unto death. The Führer principle, the leader principle. Germany had been hard hit, of course, by the Depression, 1929, 1930, and 3 years later, in 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, and we know what follows from that. So here Freud is writing about group psychology, in which, as we're going to see, the leader principle is very central for Freud, and at the same time, the leader principle is absolutely central for Hitler. Freud begins by reviewing the work on group psychology by other major contributors to the field. First of all, Gabriel Tarde, born in 1843, died in 1904, and his book is called The Laws of Imitation, published in 1890. Then Gustave Le Bon, born 1871, died 1931. His book is The Crowd, A Study in Social Psychology, published in 1895. Then William Mcdougall, born 1871, died in 1938, 1 year before Freud's death. His book is The Group Mind, published in 1920, the year before Freud publishes Group Psychology. And finally, Sigmund Freud himself, born 1856, died 1939. His book is Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, published in 1921. Now there's a common theme linking all of these books: regression. Individuals act differently in groups than they do in isolation, all of these authors argue, while occasionally in groups they act better than they would as individuals. Sometimes the group inspires people to act better, but more often they regress. Unconscious motives emerge, says Freud. The group produces, quotes, a sentiment of invincible power and omnipotence, and this enables individuals to act out impulses that they would ordinarily restrain. In the group, individual responsibility disappears, repressions are thrown off, says Freud, conscience disappears. By conscience he means superego. He uses superego and conscience interchangeably. I myself make an important distinction between the two. But superego, or conscience, for Freud disappears often in the group. This does not surprise Freud, because he thinks that very few people really have a developed internalized superego anyhow. Most people don't have much of a superego, Freud thought. If they conform, it's not due to internalized standards. It's because of what he calls social anxiety. Namely, it's the fear of being caught. It's the fear of being punished. That's what keeps most people in line, not an internalized moral superego. So with group encouragement and with the anonymity that the group affords, unconscious impulses are often unrestrained. Freud is reviewing the contributions of these other theorists. Le Bon points to contagion or suggestibility, hypnosis. Group members come to be in a special state very like hypnosis, but then Freud asks, who is the hypnotizer? And of course, for Freud, the answer is the Führer, the leader. Freud agrees with Le Bon's description of this regression that happens in groups. There is a lowering of intellectual ability. People become impulsive. The group is intense, but it has no perseverance. There is this sense of omnipotence. The group is credulous, ready to believe anything, open to influence. There is no critical faculty. Critical thinking disappears. Group members think in images. In Lacanian terms, we would say the imaginary, or rather than the symbolic, prevails. There is no doubt. There is no uncertainty. In groups, people go to extremes. There's no middle ground. In Kleinian terms, this is the paranoid schizoid position, where splitting predominates, all good, all bad, black and white. In order to influence the group, one must exaggerate, repeat. One must paint in the most forcible colors. The group is intolerant. It respects force. It's only slightly influenced by kindness. It tends to see kindness as weakness. The group wants to fear and be ruled by a master. In the group, inhibitions fall away, and the cruel and the brutal, destructive impulses rise. As we've seen, sometimes the group can raise moral standards and achieve great things through self-abnegation and unselfish devotion to the group. But intellectual ability is always lowered. If occasionally moral standards can be raised, intellectual ability is always lowered. And whether moral standards are raised or not depends on the point of view in which you look at this. Sometimes the group will produce self-abnegation and unselfish devotion to the group, but the group might be engaged in mass killing. So whether that's a raising of moral standards or not depends definitely on your point of view. Freud argues that the group mind then is primitive and infantile. Contradictions can exist side by side. This is Freud's primary process thinking, as distinct from the logical secondary process thinking, the rational thinking of everyday life. That disappears. The primary process, this primitive form of thinking, takes over. People believe in the magical power of words and formulas. And here's a quotation from Freud, "And finally, groups have never thirsted after truth. They demand illusions and cannot do without them. They instantly give what is unreal precedence over what is real. They are almost as strongly influenced by what is untrue as by what is true. They have an evident tendency not to distinguish between the two, truth and untruth. Reality testing declines in favor of wish-fulfilling fantasy." That has a chilling ring today in what some people, since the election of Donald Trump, are calling a post-truth era. Certainly this quotation from Freud points to phenomena that we see vividly around us these days. They give what is unreal precedence over what is real. They're almost as strongly influenced by what is untrue as by what is true. They have an evident tendency not to distinguish between the two. According to Le Bon, the group is an obedient herd. They place themselves under a chief. He must have a strong faith in an idea to awaken the group's faith. Both the idea and the leader must have prestige. This, of course, is what the great German sociologist Max Weber called charisma. The charismatic leader who is intensely invested in his idea, in his faith. One could say that, Freud doesn't exactly say this, but in Freudian terms one could say that the group regression means the strengthening of both the id and the superego over the ego. Remember, id and superego are closely allied. The superego is fueled by id aggression, turned largely on the self, and sometimes displaced away from the self onto others, onto the scapegoat. But id and superego in Freudian theory, in Freud's own theory, not so much post-Freudian theory. I mean, the post-Freudian theory kind of whitewashed the superego to a considerable extent and got it very much confused with a moral conscience. In my view, it is not at all a moral conscience. What it is hate, turned either on the self or on other people, scapegoats. So one could say that the group regression means the strengthening of both id and superego, at the same time a weakening of the ego. The critical thinking faculty disappears. Impulsiveness and cruel moralism intensify. Both sadistic and masochistic impulses emerge. Masochistic submission to a leader. Sadistic impulses to attack the other, othering, the scapegoating process. Okay, at this point in chapter 3, Freud shifts gears a bit and he adopts William Mcdougall's insight that all of this regression applies only to the unstructured, not to the structured group. So let's compare and contrast the two. The unstructured group is short-lived. It's a crowd. It has no organization. It's emotional, impulsive, violent, fickle, suggestible. It's like an unruly child. So our example of the unstructured group could be a lynch mob. A lynch mob. They rise up. They have no patience for law and order. They don't want to wait for a trial. They feel they know who's guilty. They break into the jail. Otherwise decent people, the guy who usually runs the hardware store, he brings a rope. Someone else brings a ladder. They find a tree. And a hanging occurs. And then everybody goes home. So this is a very short-lived, emotional, impulsive group without any ongoing organization. Compare this to the structured group. The structured group endures over a greater period of time, sometimes very long periods of times. It's organized. It's institutionalized. It has continuity. It has an idea of its own nature and its own composition. It has an idea of its different functions. It assigns people to different roles. You be president, you be treasurer, you be secretary. So it has a system of functions. It has traditions. It has customs, and sometimes its traditions and customs are written down in a handbook of some kind. It interacts with other groups. Okay, the structure and the organization of the group, especially for Freud, as part of the structure, Freud emphasizes the role of the leader. Having a leader, a Führer, prevents regression. Structure and leadership for Freud keep secondary process reality orientation in place. Structure and organization maintain what, as we will see shortly, Bion calls the work group, W for short, the work group. And it prevents the work group from regressing into what he calls basic assumption groups. If we want to put this into the language of Melanie Klein, the structured group operates in D, in the depressive position, whereas the unstructured group regresses to PS, to the paranoid schizoid position. Bion's work group, W, operates in the depressive position, where his basic assumption groups are operating in the paranoid schizoid position. Structured group, secondary process thinking. Unstructured group, primary process thinking. Structured group is guided more by what Freud calls the ego, whereas the unstructured group is dominated by id on the one hand and superego on the other. Let's make this contrast between the structured and the unstructured. Let's use the illustration of the difference between mobs, like that lynch mob, and what, at least in North America, is known as the mob. The mob is organized crime. There are structures, leaders, roles, rules, rituals. The mob, quite distinct from these temporary, highly emotional and pretty irrational groups called mobs. Okay, Freud really emphasizes the role of the leader. And it's very significant then that his choice of two examples of structured groups are, on the one hand, the church, and on the other, the army. Both have a leader, Christ, on the one hand, and the commander-in-chief on the other. Both of these structured groups are high in authority and on rather authoritarian leadership. Freud thinks other students of group psychology have underestimated the role of the leader. I think in compensation he overestimates the role of the leader, because Freud has no sense of groups that are structured not by a leader, but by democratically established constitutions, charters of rights and responsibilities, democratically established rules and roles, and so on. Freud has very little sense of democratically structured groups. His overall model is a master-slave model, and this is quite consistent with his patriarchal, authoritarian, and hierarchical conception. Basically, this is a dominance submission model. And this, of course, is the way he organized the International Psychoanalytic Association along these patriarchal, authoritarian, and hierarchical lines. As we know, he organized a secret committee for the preservation of the faith, and so on. A very interesting article was published by the American analyst Arnold Richards in 2016 in Contemporary Psychoanalysis, Volume 52, Number 1. called The Left and the Far Left in American Psychoanalysis. Turns out that some of the key leaders of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute and the American Psychoanalytic Association had been, before the Second World War, had been card-carrying members of the Communist Party of the USA. That is, they were Marxist-Leninists. I've got nothing against their Marxism. It's their Leninism. That's the problem. I'm talking about Jacob Arlo, Charles Brenner, Ralph Greenson, all card-carrying members of the CPUSA. Of course, with the rise of McCarthyism and so on, I mean, they probably broke with the party much earlier. Probably some of them broke with the party at the time of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And then they put this behind them and pretty much kept it a secret. But to me, this explains why they felt so comfortable in the organization established by Freud. Because Lenin, like Freud, established organizations along highly hierarchical, authoritarian, and patriarchal lines with secret committees. I mean, Leninism is about a vanguard party of intellectuals who rule the organization, often quite secretly. Freud's secret committee is essentially the same kind of idea. So no wonder Brenner, Arlo, Greenson, these guys felt at home in the IPA. It mirrored the kind of Leninist organization they were used to. Okay. I'm not going to go through the whole rest of this book. Suffice it to say that there are many other good ideas in group psychology. For example, Freud's distinction between in-group and out-group psychology. In any group, people who have to be together will develop elements of ambivalence and outright hostility towards one another. And the building hostility within the group can potentially explode the group, destroy the group. One way that the group can prevent this from happening is channeling the hostility towards an outgroup. That is, to scapegoat an outgroup. Sometimes the hostility within the group that would otherwise tear the group apart is channeled outwards into other nations. I mean, America was in trouble at the end of the Cold War. I mean, the Russian enemy was no longer there, but they quickly found another enemy, Islamic fundamentalism. Sometimes the group, instead of inflicting the aggression on groups outside entirely, will turn to subgroups within. A subgroup within will be scapegoated. The Jews, black people, whatever. Of course, this is also very useful to the elites, because if the elites, if the 1% can foment divisions within the 99%, all of this infighting among the potential opposition will undermine their capacity to form a united front against the ruling class. So this is the strategy of divide and conquer, which is a variant of in-group, out-group psychology. Also, in group psychology, Freud makes an important contribution to object relations theory. A lot of people think that object relations theory was founded by post-Freudians. Not true. Freud is the first ego psychologist, and he's also the first object relations theorist. This becomes most evident probably in 1917 in Mourning and Melancholia, where Freud begins to use the concepts of introjection. An object from the external world is introjected, taken into the internal world, and often identified with. And these themes of introjection and identification are expanded upon in this volume as well. And Freud distinguishes between identification, or introjection into the ego, on the one hand, and introjection of an object into the superego. This is an important distinction. When, say, the leader is introjected into the ego, this results in an identification. The group member now identifies with the leader, as do other group members, and through this common identification with the leader, there's an identification with each other, and this holds the group together to some degree. But when there is introjection into the superego, we have a much more dangerous process. The leader is introjected into the superego. It's as if now the leader is the leader comes to replace the superego. The leader colonizes the superego. I put the leader in the place of my superego. The leader takes over my superego function. I surrender my superego to the leader. I'm no longer a morally self-regulating person, regulating myself through my own superego operations. I've surrendered self-regulation to the leader. I simply obey. As Freud points out, so does the hypnotized subject, and sometimes we see this in relations of love, where the lover surrenders his self-regulating functions to the beloved. All of this work on introjection of the leader into the superego prefigures the work of Stanley Milgram, who, after the Second War, asked really the question, why did so many people submit to Hitler? And he designs those famous experiments on obedience, in which a student thinks that a fellow student in the next room is answering arithmetic questions and getting them wrong, and when he gets them wrong, he has to give him a shock, and he has to increase the intensity of the shocks because he keeps getting the wrong answers, and the scientist in the white coat tells him, this is in the interest of science, you must go on, and the guy in the next room starts screaming, but you must go on, and then having screamed, he falls silent, but you must still turn up the electricity, and a tiny minority of people were strong enough and had superegos enough, or conscience enough, I would say, to say, I refuse to carry on. The vast majority carried on, right to the end. So this is a graphic experimental illustration of what can happen when we surrender the superego function to a leader. Okay. There are two ways of reading all of this work about regression in groups. I think the first way of reading it is the more common. People read Freud as warning against the regressive forces in groups that threaten democracy. They see his book as anticipating the rise of Hitler and Hitler's appeal to the masses. In other words, they read Freud very like I think we could legitimately read Erich Fromm, who in 1943 published Escape from Freedom. Fromm was writing about how the masses are ready to escape from freedom, either into communist totalitarianism or into Nazi totalitarianism, because freedom, individual self-responsibility is such a burden people are very ready to escape from this by submitting to a leader. Now, for Fromm, this is clearly a warning. Fromm was a Democrat, and he wanted to preserve democracy against the totalitarian threats from both the left and the right. He was a Marxist, but not a Leninist. He was a democratic Marxist, and was very interested in democracy. And so a lot of people assume that that's how we should understand Freud. This is how Freud is commonly understood, but I feel this reading is inaccurate. So I'm going to quote now from a chapter of my forthcoming book titled Psychoanalytic Thinking, Essays in Critique. It will be brought out by Routledge sometime in 2018. Quotes, "Today it is the fashion among liberal-minded psychoanalysts to advance the wishful illusion that due to his support for free clinics," Danto, 2005, writes about Freud's support of free clinics for the poor, and due to his support, Freud's support for some degree of income redistribution grounded in his own experience of poverty as a child, that Freud therefore was at the very least a liberal, if not a social democrat. Richards, in that article, tries to make the case that Freud is a social democrat. Anyone interested in scholarly objectivity, however, will be forced to take note of such contrary facts as the inscription Freud wrote in presenting one of his books to Mussolini. Quotes, "Benito Mussolini, with the respectful greetings of an old man who recognizes in the ruler the cultural hero," unquote. This was, of course, before Mussolini turned on the Jews. Freud changed his attitude. But at one point, Freud had great admiration for the leader as cultural hero. In its stress upon the dangerously regressive and irrational proclivities of groups, Freud's group psychology, like the works of Le Bon, Tard, and others, contributes to the literature on mob psychology produced by bourgeois thinkers fearful of the power of the masses to make revolution, as they had in 1789, the French Revolution, recall the storming of the Bastille, and again in 1917, the Russian Revolution. Bourgeois thinkers were suspicious of mob psychology because mobs had a way of overthrowing them. Given the central emphasis in his group psychology on the need for strong leadership to prevent regression, his obliviousness to groups organized instead by democratically instituted charters of rights and responsibilities, given his disparaging remarks about the proletariat as lazy, stupid, and oversexed, given his view of America, including its democracy, as, quotes, a mistake, a gigantic mistake. That's reported by Ernest Jones, 1955, page 67. We might be inclined to agree with him these days that America is a mistake, a gigantic mistake, but I would argue that it was a glorious experiment that seems to be failing. Given his organization of the IPA along authoritarian top-down lines with secret committees dedicated to the preservation of the faith and so on, in the light of all of this, Freud's gesture of respect towards Mussolini, the great leader, becomes intelligible. His view of the superego as the source of law and order and a bulwark against barbarism formed a central element of Freud's increasingly reactionary socio-political vision, a perspective that may well have inclined some of his readers, such as Henry Kissinger, to view Western, or more accurately, American power as the superego, defending civilization against the unruly, primitive id forces threatening from the East. One writer who really got this was Franz Alexander, psychoanalyst, trained in Germany, moved to America, established the Chicago Institute of Psychoanalysis. He wrote an introduction to the Bantam edition in 1960 of Freud's group psychology. And in this book, Alexander argued that while in neurosis the superego operates like a primitive absolute ruler, Führer, in maturity the superego can no longer be differentiated from the ego, which governs democratically. Essentially, he's arguing that the superego Freud described is a neurotic, authoritarian superego. In healthy people, in mature people, psychologically mature people, the superego is really not that distinguishable from the ego. That is, it rules rationally and democratically. I personally prefer to say that in maturity the superego is deconstructed and replaced by what I call the conscience, not the ego. But that's an argument that I have made in other places and other times. For Alexander, Freud's theory may apply to mob psychology, to unstructured groups, but not to groups that are organized, and organized not necessarily by the leader, as emphasized by Freud, as in his examples of the church and the army, with central authority, but instead organized along democratic lines, organizations composed of independent, self-governing individuals who, if mature, have a very different attitude towards leaders. Mature people are not submissive towards leaders, but suspicious of them. Not submissive, but critical, watching them like a hawk, ready to throw them out of office, expecting them to be corrupt, ready to get rid of them. They may even set up a form of government characterized by checks and balances, as the original American experiment did. Checks and balances to help prevent anyone from achieving absolute power on the grounds that no one can be trusted with it, except perhaps the Lord, and he hasn't returned yet. Alexander points out that Freud's theory was highly influenced by his social milieu. He grew up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, ruled by the Habsburgs, by Emperor Franz Joseph. He had no experience, really, with democracy. And this is reflected in his emphasis on leadership and authority. Bion, too, says that whereas Le Bon and others have ignored the role of the leader, in Bion's view, Freud exaggerates it. Bion points out that often, instead of the leader dominating the group, quite the reverse happens. When the leader doesn't lead the group in the direction the group wants to go, it simply dumps that leader and chooses a new leader who will take the group where it wants to go. Freud does not understand societies held together by common abstract principles and ideals such as freedom, individual responsibility, and self-government, rather than by a strong leader. Alexander writes, quotes, "The guiding principles of free societies, the stress on the individual's critical faculty and self-responsibility, are contradictory to that blind obedience to authority which is the essence of hypnosis." And of course Freud, to a considerable extent, took the hypnotic situation as his example of what happens in the group situation. Okay, in summary, while warning us of the dangers of regression, Freud's group psychology fails to point the way beyond the id and its repression by the superego. He fails to point us beyond regression on the one hand and authoritarianism on the other. In my view, democratic principles and institutions represent both rationality and mature morality. They represent both the ego, reason, and conscience. In Kleinian terms, democracy represents the depressive position, or Bion's work group, W, while both the regressed masses and the dominating superego authority are operating in the paranoid schizoid position. Due to his neglect of democratic principles and his excessive pessimism regarding human nature in general, and his excessive pessimism regarding human nature in general and the proletariat in particular, Freud fails to really help us transcend the master-slave dialectic. Okay, turning now to Bion. During the Second War, Bion conducted some fascinating experiments at the Northfield Military Hospital in England with groups of British soldiers, and he reported on this work in his 1959 book, Experiences in Groups. Bion would arrange for a group of people to meet together regularly with him to work together on their emotional problems. They thought that this would be group therapy, and they expected this group therapy to be led by Dr. Bion. But he would then refrain from leading the group, restricting himself to making occasional comments on the group's behavior. Instead of functioning as a group leader, as group members expected him to, he operated as a largely silent group analyst, sat there sucking on his pipe silently, restricting himself to occasional interpretations of the group's behavior in response to his abdication of the expected leadership role. These came to be known as leaderless groups. The type of group that remains focused on and effective in carrying out its work, Bion called the work group, W. It generally requires active leadership and a clear structure of roles, rules, and responsibilities to be maintained. When the expected leader abdicates, as Bion did, the work group tends emotionally to regress and to lose sight of the work it's supposed to be doing. Instead, it begins to behave in accordance with what Bion described as irrational basic assumptions. Basic assumptions are essentially the same thing as Melanie Klein describes as fantasies, spelt with a PH, unconscious fantasies. So the work group operates in Melanie Klein's depressive position, whereas the basic assumptions come to the front when the group regresses into the paranoid schizoid position. So in the absence of clear structure and leadership, the work group is displaced by one or another of three basic assumption groups, depending upon which of the three basic assumptions achieves dominance in the group at any particular time. In the BAD group, BAD, Basic Assumption Dependency, the group assumes it needs an omnipotent and omniscient leader. Those are the two of the three classical definitions of God: omnipotent, all-powerful; omniscient, all-knowing; benevolent, all-good. So in BAD, the group assumes it needs a God, and it longs for and it awaits the return of this God. God has died. The leader has abdicated the leadership role. God has died. The group feels it needs a God. It awaits the return of the god or demigod upon whom it can depend for direction and salvation. Okay, basic assumption dependency. Second is the BAP, basic assumption pairing. The group tacitly supports the building relationship between a pair of its members. Instead of resenting that two of these people are hooking up, it could be a man and a woman, it could be two men, it could be two women, doesn't matter. The group is kind of fascinated by the fact that these two are hooking up in some way, and the group tacitly supports this, as if the group assumes that their union will magically result in the salvation of the entire group, perhaps through the birth of a Messiah who will lead the group into the promised land. Somehow these two are getting together, and the rest of the group seem to be thinking somehow through their getting together some solution will be born that will lead us out of this wasteland that we find ourselves in, since Bion is refusing to do his job and lead the group, since God has died. Basic assumption pairing. And then finally, the third BAF, basic assumption fight-flight. The group feels itself to be threatened and imperiled by some enemy, and it seeks a leader who will organize it for and lead it in a fight or in flight. So perhaps it's already clear how all of this may be applied to the interpretation of William Golding's novel Lord of the Flies. The experience of the boys resembles that of Bion's group members in that both suffer from an initial lack of leadership, due in one case to Bion's abdication, and in the other by the absence of any adult leadership on the island. The plane has crashed, the adults, officers have died. The boys are alone on this island. So one of the main points of Bion's work, and perhaps of Golding's novel, concerns the need human beings have for the security and sense of safety that's normally provided by competent leadership that is realistic, rational, and scientifically grounded, and for group organization and structure. In the most recent film version of Golding's novel, such technical competence and organization are symbolized at the end of the film by the Marine Corps rescuers, and in the actual story itself by the Cadet Corps, with its rules and leadership hierarchy. The boys on the plane are part of a Cadet Corps, and Ralph is a cadet colonel. Rational leadership is also symbolized by Ralph's rational concern to maintain a signal fire in order to facilitate rescue, and his use of Piggy's glasses. Piggy has the thick glasses, and he knows that you can focus sunlight and start a fire this way. Piggy also knows how to make a conch shell function like a Cadet Corps bugle, which they use to summon the boys to a group meeting, a meeting of the community. So the conch shell, the bugle, symbolizes democracy, a gathering of the community to make decisions. Piggy also has other knowledge. He knows that we need to guard against eating poison berries or eating uncooked pork. And together, Ralph and Piggy represent the need to maintain rules and regulations for the community. So this is rational authority or leadership. This is Freud's ego, represented by Ralph and Piggy. Whereas Ralph and Piggy represent leadership based upon the values of reason, science, and democracy, there's another leader, Simon, who represents the civilized and humane values of kindness, empathy, and care. Simon displays a gentle and compassionate concern with the creatures of the forest, and in one film version of the novel, he nurses and protects one of the dying captains. In one sense, however, he too stands for reason. He comes to tell the boys that the monster they fear in the cave is merely the dying captain. But before he can alleviate their irrational anxiety through this revelation, he is killed by Jack's crazed horde. Viewed as a Christian allegory, Simon represents gentle Jesus, offering us love and faith to replace our hatred and fear of death, but who himself is slain. He becomes the target of our irrational, fear-driven hatred and is killed. He's trying to bring the good news. Gospel means good news. He's trying to bring the good news, but before he can deliver it, he's slain by Jack's horde. He represents conscience. Ralph and Piggy represent the ego. Simon represents a truly moral conscience. So these three leaders, Ralph, Piggy, and Simon, succeed in providing humane and rational leadership for a time, but they're only boys after all, and in the face of growing anxiety at not being rescued, exacerbated by Jack's spreading the myth of the monster, the values of reason and compassion that they represent are gradually displaced by the regressive, magical, and authoritarian type of leadership provided by Jack, a leadership founded upon fear and hatred rather than reason and love. This is a novel well worth reading today, along with Orwell's 1984. Bion observed that such regressive leadership, like Jack, often emerges in the so-called fight-flight type of leaderless group. He writes, quotes, "The kind of leadership that is recognized as appropriate in this situation is the leadership of the man who mobilizes the group to attack somebody, or alternatively, to lead it in flight," unquote. Since the flight option was not available to these boys, trapped on an island, fight became the only regressive option. But fighting requires that there be an enemy. The alternative leader, Jack, provides the boys with something to attack, initially through the hunt, the wild boar, and later through the myth of the monster. Well, it's obvious that one way to read Lord of the Flies is as an allegory referring to the breakdown of the Weimar Republic's attempt at German democracy between the wars and the emergence of Hitler and his genocidal scapegoating of the Jews. Toward the end of the novel, Simon is mistaken by the frenzied boys for the monster. Piggy, the voice of reason, is killed, and Ralph, the former leader, is hunted. These are attacks on reason and conscience. When the rational leadership fails, Bion writes, most groups find a substitute that satisfies them very well. Quotes, "It is usually a man or woman with marked paranoid trends. Perhaps if the presence of an enemy is not immediately obvious to the group, the next best thing is for the group to choose a leader to whom it is obvious. That is, a paranoid person. In one of Bion's groups, a Mr. X emerged as leader. Bion writes, quotes, Mr. X had no need to speak in this group. He was at one with the group. For the feelings about which he is most guilty, his destructive hatred, are feelings which are licensed by the basic assumption that the group has come together to fight or to run away." As the basic assumption of fight, flight, and magical thinking take over, the group comes to be more and more hostile to reason. Quotes, "Group power is believed to flow not from science, but from magic." Quotes, One of the characteristics demanded of the leader of the group, then, is that he should either be a magician or behave like one. Unlike Sigmund Freud and Gustave Le Bon, who believed the leader exercised suggestive and charismatic power over the group, much as the hypnotist holds the hypnotic subject in his sway, Bion believed the group shapes and selects the leader rather than the leader shaping the group. For Bion, when the leader does not respond or correspond to the needs of the basic assumption group, the group simply ignores him and chooses another leader. We witness this in Lord of the Flies, as under the sway of their building anxiety, the boys increasingly come to abandon the work group and its rational and compassionate leaders, Ralph, Piggy, and Simon. Anxiety has intensified their dependency longings, which they channel toward Jack. Jack then stimulates their anxiety further and directs it into the fight with the monster and its surrogates, the scapegoated former leaders of the work group. Bion writes that the new leader, quotes, "The new leader, in my experience, is without exception a thoroughgoing psychiatric case. We have reached the position. The group is engaged in sustaining, placating, soothing, flattering, and deferring to its most ill member, who is now the group leader," unquote. When I presented this material sometime last year, one of the students asked at this point, "Is this the Trump effect?" Bion goes on to elaborate on the fact that in these situations, with the failure of rational and compassionate leadership, the group turns to, quotes, "the most psychiatrically disordered member for leadership," unquotes. The belief in the, quote again, "the belief in the holiness of idiots, the belief that genius is akin to madness, all indicate this same tendency of the group to choose, when left unstructured, its most ill member as its leader." Quotes, "In its search for a leader, the group finds a paranoid schizophrenic or malignant hysteric, if possible. Failing either of these, a psychopathic personality with delinquent trends will do. Failing a psychopathic personality, it will pick on the verbally facile, high-grade defective." I think he means malignant narcissist. He says, "I have at no time experienced a group of more than 5 people that could not provide a good specimen of one of these," unquote. Well, I think America found a pretty good specimen of one of these. So let me summarize 3 key points. 1, in the absence of rational structured authority, structured either by leadership or by democratic principles, groups regress, and they become governed by irrational basic assumptions such as fight-flight. To prevent this from happening, rational structure and organization appear necessary. 2, when such regression occurs, groups turn to their most psychiatrically disturbed member as an alternative leader. 3, this paranoid, hysterical, psychopathic, or narcissistic leader stimulates the group's anxieties, as did Jack's spreading the myth of the monster, and offer a spurious sense of security through his or her apparent energy and certainty through the use of magic and through scapegoating individuals or groups as the monster to be feared and eliminated. So the next time you're in a situation where rational authority is absent or appears to have failed, and you find yourself drawn to a substitute leader, ask yourself the question, am I beginning to put my trust in the most emotionally deranged person in the group? In a broader sense, Bion's study of groups finds that they show the 2 levels of mental functioning Melanie Klein saw operating in the mind of every individual: a primitive layer characterized by magical and polarized all good, all bad thinking or splitting and dominated by hate, envy, and paranoid anxieties; the paranoid schizoid position, which corresponds to the basic assumption group, and a more civilized layer characterized by rational, reality-oriented thought and governed more by reason, gratitude, concern, and love, depressive position. Just as individuals, we may regress under stress from D into PS, so may groups regress under stress from the work group to the basic assumption group. The moral of the story is that if we seek to prevent such regression, clear structure, rules, organization, and rational and compassionate leadership are required as are steps to alleviate anxiety and diffuse its power to bring about regression. Okay, let me end with critique. Bion, like Freud, is a rationalist. He emphasizes the rational far too much. Here Golding is more insightful because in addition to the rational leaders, Ralph and Piggy, Golding gives us Simon. Bion makes no place for Simon, really. Simon represents the good. I don't know whether Golding may have had in mind the Simon of the New Testament narrative, Simon of Cyrene, called the cross-bearer. He's the man who the Romans forced when Jesus could no longer carry the cross. He carried the cross to Golgotha. Simon of Cyrene. Maybe Golding had that in mind, I'm not sure. Rationality just is not enough. Rationality simply gives us a means-end logic. If your end is to build a bridge, well, here's how you do it. But it doesn't tell you whether you ought to build a bridge or not. Rationality cannot specify ends, only means to ends. Rationality says nothing about the moral or immoral character of the ends that we choose to pursue. Secular humanism wants to believe that reason can specify reasonable ends, but it cannot do so, because reason cannot deduce an ought from an is. Reason and science are descriptive. They can't be prescriptive. Bion celebrates the work group, but the Nazis had very efficient work groups. The Blitzkrieg, very efficient work group. The death camps, very efficient at killing large numbers of people. One historian, Peter Vierek, described the Nazis as barbarians in jet planes. The rational ego can design and operate jet planes, but that doesn't prevent a barbarian from being the pilot. Ralph and Piggy are not enough. We need Simon. We need the one who brings love and healing, not just rational truth. Unfortunately, this one is often killed and scapegoated. But what I'm saying here is that Melanie Klein, I think, is superior to Bion, because Bion associates the depressive position with W, with the work group. Klein associates the depressive position not merely with rationality. She associates the depressive position with what Winnicott called the capacity for concern for the other, which is what Melanie Klein meant by depressive anxiety, not depression. In the depressive position, we don't get depression. We get depressive anxiety, which is concern, the concern that I may have harmed the other. And depressive anxiety or concern leads into my attempts to make reparation, to repair the harm that I've done. She also associates the move into the depressive position with gratitude as opposed to envy, with love and with reparation. All of this Golding symbolizes as Simon, and this is the theme that is missing in the work of Wilfred Bion. It's not entirely missing in Freud. Freud too is a rationalist, but in a few places, of course, Freud celebrates eros, love, over thanatos, hate. And in one place early on in his 1914 essay on narcissism, Freud actually says we must begin to love if we are not to fall ill, and we must fall ill if we are unable to love. But that celebration of love, of Simon, is downplayed by Freud in much of his work. It's not absent, but it's downplayed in favor of Freud's overall celebration of reason and rationality. Okay. Next week we'll carry on with Lecture 2 on the specific contributions of Wilfred Bion.